They called Steve McQueen a thief when studio executives discovered him demanding hundreds of Levi's jeans and electric heaters in his movie contracts. Hollywood's most difficult star was stealing from major studios, they whispered, enriching himself through elaborate schemes that exploited his contractual power. Then investigators followed a mysterious unmarked truck through the California night and discovered the thousands of orphans he was secretly saving. The dusty roads to Chino suddenly felt heavier than any movie set. If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy, October 1968. Warner Brothers executive offices, where decisions worth millions were made by men who measured human value in box office receipts and insurance premiums. The conference room table was covered with contracts, legal documents, and the kind of paperwork that transformed artistic dreams into commercial realities. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like fog over a battlefield, mixing with the tension that came when studio executives encountered demands they couldn't categorize or control. 200 pairs of Levi's jeans, read the executive vice president, his voice carrying the exasperation of someone who'd spent decades dealing with temperamental stars but had never encountered requirements this bizarre. 100 electric heaters, 50 winter coats. What the hell is McQueen doing with all this merchandise? The contract negotiations had been brutal, even by Hollywood standards. Steve McQueen, fresh from completing Bullet, commanded more money and creative control than any actor in the industry. But his demands went beyond standard star requirements to include lists of equipment and supplies that made no sense for personal use or professional necessity. "He's probably selling it," suggested the studio's head of business affairs, a nervous man whose job involved protecting Warner Brothers from the creative and financial excesses that characterized major star behavior. Secondary market for studio merchandise, classic star scam, or stockpiling for some kind of survivalist fantasy, offered another executive. "You know how these motorcycle guys think, always preparing for the apocalypse. Whatever he's doing, it's costing us a fortune. Every contract includes more weird demands. Tools, clothing, heating equipment, electronic devices. It's like he's outfitting an army." The executives studied the paperwork with the analytical attention that characterized their approach to any problem that threatened studio profitability. McQueen's demands had escalated with each successive film, growing from simple perks to elaborate lists that resembled military supply requisitions rather than celebrity indulgences. Should we investigate? How? Follow Steve McQueen around Los Angeles to see where he takes studio property. That's a good way to lose our most bankable star and our job simultaneously. Maybe we should just accept that this is the cost of doing business with the biggest movie star in the world. But none of them understood what they were actually financing through their reluctant compliance with McQueen's seemingly irrational contractual demands. Later that night, an unmarked truck pulled away from Warner Brothers, rear-loading dock-carrying cargo that had been loaded without studio supervision or documentation. The driver wore a baseball cap pulled low over features that studio security didn't recognize, though something about his movements suggested familiarity with both the facility and the equipment being transported. The truck navigated Los Angeles streets with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey many times before, avoiding main thoroughfares in favor of routes that minimized visibility and reduced the chances of unwanted attention. Past the glamorous facades of Hollywood into industrial areas where real work was done by people who never appeared on screen or attended premieres. Eastbound on the San Bernardino freeway toward destinations that had nothing to do with entertainment industry business or celebrity lifestyle maintenance. Through communities that existed beyond the reach of studio publicity departments, where people lived according to economics that had nothing to do with box office success or critical acclaim. The truck turned off Highway 71 onto country roads that wound through agricultural land toward facilities that served purposes most Hollywood residents never considered. Past dairy farms and citrus groves toward institutions that handled society's most vulnerable populations with resources stretched far beyond adequate levels. Boys Republic, Chino, California. Founded in 1907 as a rehabilitation facility for troubled youth, the campus sprawled across rolling hills that had once been ranch land. Dormitories, classrooms, workshops, and administrative buildings designed to house and educate young men whose lives had been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. Tonight, the facility was dark except for security lights that created pools of illumination along pathways between buildings. The unmarked truck pulled through gates that opened without challenge, as if this arrival was expected rather than surprising. Past dormitories, where 200 boys slept in beds that provided more safety and stability than most had ever experienced before arriving at this place that served as last resort for kids who'd exhausted other options. Steve McQueen, 38 years old, climbed from the driver's seat with movements that carried none of the swagger that characterized his screen presence. Wearing work clothes that looked genuinely worn rather than costume department approximations, he moved with quiet efficiency that suggested this was routine rather than exceptional activity. Hollywood's most notorious difficult star transforming into someone who looked like any other delivery driver completing normal business. The truck's cargo represented months of careful planning disguised as celebrity excess. Every item on those studio requisitions had been selected for specific purposes that served needs McQueen understood better than any studio executive could imagine. 200 pairs of Levi's because growing boys needed clothing that could survive hard use. Electric heaters because institutional heating systems never provided adequate warmth in dormitories built with economy rather than comfort in mind. Max Scott, the facility's director, emerged from the administration building with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd learned to expect miracles from unexpected sources. A man who'd spent 30 years working with troubled youth, understanding that salvation often came through individuals rather than institutions, from people who gave without expectation of recognition or reward. "Steve, you don't need to do this personally," Scott said, keeping his voice low enough to avoid disturbing sleepers in nearby dormitories. "We could arrange for regular deliveries through normal channels. Normal channels create records, records create publicity, publicity ruins everything." McQueen began unloading cargo with systematic efficiency that suggested experience with physical labor beyond what actors typically acquired through professional training. Each item handled with care that indicated understanding of its value to recipients who had little and appreciated everything. "The boys don't know where this comes from? They know someone cares enough to help. That's what matters. And you're sure you don't want any recognition, tax benefits, public relations value? Any of the things celebrities usually get from charitable activities?" McQueen stopped unloading and looked directly at Scott with those pale blue eyes that had made audiences pay attention since he'd first appeared on screen. "Max, I was one of these kids, 15 years old, nowhere else to go, convinced that nobody gave a damn whether I lived or died. You and this place saved my life. That was different. You earned your way through the program through your own effort and determination. I earned my way because someone gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. These kids deserve the same chance." The unloading continued in comfortable silence, two men who understood each other's motivations without requiring extensive explanation. Scott had seen hundreds of boys come through the program, understanding that success often depended on small kindnesses that provided hope during periods when hope seemed impossible to justify. "Steve, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why the secrecy? Why not let people know you're doing this? It might inspire other successful people to contribute." McQueen considered the question while placing the last box of supplies near the building entrance where staff would find it the following morning. "Because the minute this becomes public, it becomes about me instead of them. Reporters want to write about movie stars doing good deeds, not about kids who need help. And you think publicity would interfere with the actual purpose? I know it would. I've watched what happens when celebrities get involved with charities. Everything becomes about the celebrity's image instead of the people who actually need assistance." Scott understood this perspective through years of experience with well-meaning donors whose contributions came with requirements for recognition that sometimes interfered with the programs they were supposed to support. McQueen's approach eliminated those complications by eliminating visibility entirely. "The studio executives have no idea where their merchandise is going. They think I'm stealing it for personal use, probably selling it on the black market to fund my motorcycle racing or some other expensive hobby." "And you're comfortable with them thinking that?" "I'm comfortable with them thinking whatever helps them sleep at night, as long as they keep approving the requisitions and the kids get what they need." McQueen walked toward the dormitory buildings, his footsteps silent on pathways he'd traveled as a resident rather than a visitor. Past windows where boys slept in beds that provided safety most had never experienced consistently before arriving at this place that served as bridge between failure and possibility. Through one window, a young boy had thrown off his covers during restless sleep that suggested dreams filled with memories that institutions couldn't erase overnight. McQueen quietly entered the building, moved to the boy's bedside, and gently repositioned the blanket with movements that carried the careful attention of someone who understood how important small comforts could be to people who'd learned not to expect kindness. The gesture lasted only seconds, but represented philosophy that had guided McQueen's secret charitable activities for years. Understanding that systematic help mattered more than dramatic gestures, that consistency mattered more than visibility, that dignity mattered more than gratitude. In another dormitory, an older boy sat by a window staring at landscape that looked empty under moonlight, but represented freedom from circumstances that had brought him to this place. McQueen approached quietly, removing his own watch, a Rolex that had cost more than most people earned in months, and placing it beside the boy's pillow where it would be discovered the following morning. No conversation, no explanation, no requirement for thanks or acknowledgement, just practical kindness that provided something valuable to someone who had little, from someone who understood what it felt like to have nothing and doubt whether circumstances would ever improve. The pattern continued through multiple buildings, small acts that would be discovered gradually by staff and residents who would never know their source. Tools for the automotive workshop, where boys learned trades that could provide legitimate income after graduation. Electronic equipment for classrooms, where education continued for young men whose formal schooling had been interrupted by family disasters and legal difficulties. Each contribution carefully selected for maximum practical value rather than maximum publicity potential. Understanding that effective charity required understanding of actual needs rather than assumptions about what recipients should want or appreciate. As dawn approached the California foothills, McQueen completed his routine and returned to the unmarked truck that would carry him back to a world where his value was measured in box office receipts and magazine covers, rather than lives changed through opportunities that might not have existed without his intervention. "Steve," Scott called as McQueen prepared to leave. "One more question. What's that? How long do you plan to continue this?" "As long as there are kids who need help and studios willing to finance it through celebrity excess, they can't understand but feel obligated to accommodate. And if they ever discover what you're really doing," McQueen smiled with genuine humor for the first time that evening, "then I'll find another way to make it work. These kids deserve better than what circumstances gave them. If I can help provide that, I will." The truck disappeared into morning traffic, carrying a man whose public reputation bore little resemblance to his private character. Hollywood's most difficult star returning to a world that would continue to misunderstand his motivations while inadvertently financing his ongoing effort to provide hope for young people who reminded him of the person he'd once been. Years later, when studio accountants finally investigated the mysterious disappearance of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise from McQueen's contracts, they discovered clothes on the backs of boys who'd aged out of foster care, heating equipment in dormitories that housed kids with nowhere else to go, and tools in workshops where young men learned skills that would keep them out of prison. The executives who'd called McQueen a thief realized they'd been wrong about everything except the scale of his operation. He had been stealing from them, but only to give to people who needed those resources more than wealthy studios needed additional profits. The theft had been systematic, carefully planned, and absolutely successful in achieving goals that no studio board meeting would ever discuss, but that mattered more than any box office performance. Max Scott, interviewed decades later about McQueen's contributions to Boys Republic, estimated that the actor had quietly donated millions of dollars worth of assistance over years of secret operations that had never been publicized or acknowledged, money and materials that had changed hundreds of lives without generating a single newspaper article or publicity photograph. He never wanted credit, Scott remembered, never wanted recognition, never wanted anything except the knowledge that kids who reminded him of himself were getting chances he'd been lucky enough to receive when he needed them most. The full scope of McQueen's charitable activities wasn't discovered until after his death, when estate lawyers found records of donations that had been carefully hidden from public view but meticulously documented for personal tracking. Contributions to juvenile facilities, funding for educational programs, support for organizations that help troubled youth transition to productive adult lives. All of it conducted with the same secrecy that had characterized his studio merchandise operations, understanding that effective charity required focus on recipients rather than donors, on results rather than recognition, on solving problems rather than creating publicity opportunities. They called Steve McQueen a thief until they discovered the thousands of orphans he was secretly saving. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.